In Total War Warhammer, the lore of Shadows is mostly focused around damaging and debuffing enemies, though it does offer one very powerful augmentation spell. Most of its debuffs are relatively cheap if not overcast, though its best damage dealing spells can be a bit pricey. The lore of Shadows also has decent range on average, meaning your wizard can stay comfortably behind your other troops while casting. In this video, we'll analyze each spell in the lore and its own merits, noting their stats and potential uses, before doing a deep dive into which factions in the game can turn Ulgu to their own ends. This video was made for patch 4.2, so if you're currently watching in the far future, some details may have changed, but hopefully the basic sentiment remains the same. Before we begin covering the spells themselves, we should cover the Lore of Shadows lore attribute, Smoke and Mirrors. In the lore, the Shadow Wizard could teleport across the battlefield, or have appeared to have been in one place while actually being in another thanks to illusions. In the game, this functions a bit differently. When a Shadow Wizard casts a spell, all ally units map-wide gain a plus 10% boost to their speed for 24 seconds. This isn't an actively terrible passive, but definitely not the best one, even among the basic 8 battle lores. You're not taking a Shadow Wizard for this passive, that's for sure. The first spell in the Lore of Shadows is Melkoth's Mystifying Miasma. According to the lore, this spell summons confounding fog around the wizard's enemies, numbing and diluting them so they stumble and fall. In game terms, that makes it a direct damage spell. It only costs 100 gold in multiplayer and 6 wounds of magic on the battle map, so it's very easy to cast over and over again throughout a battle. You'll see it all over the campaign map, too, as it's the first spell the character with the Lore of Shadows has access to. Melkoth's Mystifying Miasma lasts for 14 seconds and has a cooldown of 29 seconds. The unit card says that the Mystifying Miasma does 46 to 93 points of damage per second, but playtesting suggests that 46 DPS is the norm. Still, over the course of its 14-second duration, that averages out to a little over 600 points of damage per cast. That's pretty decent chip damage against units with lots of models, but not a lot of hit points. The spell also doesn't seem to be affected by armor, so that 600 points of damage applies equally to state troops with 30 armor as it does to Empire Knights with 110. You could think of Melkoth's Mystifying Miasma as a budget Fate of Buna. Against heavy cavalry like Dragon Princes, it'll take away about an eighth of their hit points in a single cast. While Melkoth's Mystifying Miasma won't kill them, it'll make them that much easier to put down in future engagements. It should be noted that this damage breakdown is only accurate against units with 25 models or more. Against single entity monsters, you'll deal almost no damage. Fortunately, Melkoth's Mystifying Miasma can do more than just harm opponents. While afflicted by the miasma, a unit suffers a 25% speed debuff. This can be quite nice, especially if you're dealing with faster enemies. While I personally keep Melkoths around in multiplayer to spend my excess wounds of magic and deal some damage against expensive, low hit point units, the speed debuff does open up some useful strategic options. Cavalry and other flanking units can be slowed down, letting you safely get your troops into position, while elusive opponents can be caught and torn to pieces, preventing kiting. If Melkoth's Mystifying Miasma could be said to have one downside, it would be its range. The spell can only target opponents within 100 meters, giving it very little reach across the battlefield. If your wizard isn't properly positioned, you won't be able to get the most value out of it. Even worse, that pitiful range could potentially leave the caster in danger. 100 meters is less than most ranged weapons, letting archers, crossbowmen, and handgunners pincushion the mage. Fortunately, the miasma can be overcast for 9 wounds of magic, increasing its range to 300 meters. At this point, the spell outranges everything but artillery, and gives the spell a lot of battlefield control. While Melkoth's Mystifying Miasma isn't the reason to take a Lore of Shadows caster, it certainly isn't useless, and, as I said earlier, a great way to spend those last few drops of wounds of magic in a multiplayer match. Next, we have the Enfeebling Foe. By forcing an enemy to feel the weight of the world bearing down upon them, a Shadow Wizard can strip them of their ability to attack or defend themselves. This functions as a hex spell, reducing the melee defense and melee attack of one targeted unit by 24. Just like Melkoth's Mystifying Miasma, the spell only costs 100 gold in multiplayer and 6 wounds of magic on the battle map, though it is slightly more expensive to overcast, requiring 10 winds of magic instead of 9. The Enfeebling Foe can be unlocked relatively early in campaign, as it's in the first part of a Shadow Wizard skill tree. If you really want it, a wizard could get access to the spell by level 3. The spell lasts for 17 seconds, or 34 when overcast, has a 30-second cooldown, and can be cast from a range of 200 meters. All in all, solid stats. In my experience, the Enfeebling Foe is best used against enemy characters and monsters when they're fighting your characters and monsters. It drastically increases your ability to do damage to them while decreasing the odds they can return the favor. Even over the course of 17 seconds, you could potentially score 1 or 2 more hits with a powerful character, turning the tide of battle in your favor. While you can use the Enfeebling Foe in other circumstances, it usually doesn't last long enough to have a major impact on such engagements. With infantry and cavalry typically engaging in longer battles than the characters and monsters, you're unlikely to see much impact from the Enfeebling Foe in such cases. After the Enfeebling Foe, we come to the Withering. When casting this spell, a Shadow Wizard destroys an enemy from within by amplifying their fears and doubts. This is another Hex spell with a range of 200 meters, decreasing one enemy unit's armor and leadership by 30 and 8 respectively. Just like the previous spells we've examined, the Withering costs 6 winds of magic, but at 150 gold, it's a bit more expensive in multiplayer. It also costs more to overcast, weighing in at 12 winds of magic. On the plus side, overcasting the Withering lets it affect all enemy units in a 35-meter area, so it can be very nice in blob fights. This spell lasts for 40 seconds and has a 43-second cooldown, meaning it'll last long enough to potentially impact infantry and cavalry battles as well as those monster fights. The Withering has 2 uses. The first, and most obvious, is using it to make heavily armored enemies easier for your non-armor-piercing units to take down. This is best exemplified by casting it on a big monster, like a Carnosaur, to reduce its armor down to a more manageable value for units like archers and crossbows. If combined with other armor-reducing abilities, such as a Witch Hunter's Accusation or the Plague of Rust spell from the Lore of Metal, you could potentially reduce Archaon the Everchosen to an armor value of 0. This can be really useful in multiplayer, where nuking an expensive, heavily armored centerpiece of the enemy army could be a decent win condition. The Withering's second use is exploiting its overcasted area of effect and -8 leadership penalty. When cast on a large group of wavering units, you could potentially cause a mass break, letting you swarm through a gap in the enemy lines a few seconds earlier than you normally would. This isn't the reason to take the spell, but it does have some niche uses if you already took it for the first reason. The Penumbral Pendulum is the next spell in the Lore of Shadows, and it has a history of being ridiculously broken in multiplayer. While it's thankfully been tuned down in the years since, it's still a very powerful wind spell. When cast, the Shadow Wizard summons a titanic, spectral pendulum that quickly cuts through their foes, dealing catastrophic damage to rank-and-file units. In campaign, a Shadow Wizard can unlock it by level 3, and I definitely recommend you do so. It's also great in multiplayer, as previously mentioned. The spell costs 150 gold and can be cast for 12 winds of magic, so it's a bit pricey, but it is a wind spell, so it can hit a bunch of units if they group up properly. It also affects a pretty big area, with a 4-meter radius and an 80-meter pathway. The pendulum moves at 40 meters a second, so if a model is still in the pendulum's way when the wizard is done with the spell's 3-second casting time, they're going to get hit. The spell inflicts 36 points of damage to each model it hits, half of which is armor piercing. If you want to inflict even more carnage, you can overcast the Penumbral Pendulum for 16 winds of magic, which lets the spell do 45 points of damage to each model hit, 60% of which is armor piercing. With a range of 200 meters and a 40-second cooldown, your wizard can safely cast this from the back lines several times over the course of a prolonged battle. Sadly, like all wind spells, you can't use it on walls. That would admittedly be broken, as you could just clear a section of wall for yourself before docking it with siege showers or ladders, but it would still be fun to do. Besides that, it's an excellent spell with obvious uses. In my opinion, this is the primary reason to take the Lore of Shadows caster in the first place. Punish blobs of infantry and tightly packed range units with a giant, shadowy razor from the sky, and call it a day. Now we're approaching the Lore of Shadows top tier spells, the ones that are locked in the second half of a Shadow Wizard skill tree and campaign. The first of these is Occam's Mindrazor. This is the Lore of Shadows' only augment spell, weighing in at 200 gold in multiplayer and 8 winds of magic on the battle map. It only affects one unit when cast normally, but if overcast for 14 winds of magic, it applies to all allied units in a 35-meter area. When cast, the Shadow Wizard summons magical, ghostly weapons for their allies. These weapons can cut through flesh and bone with terrifying ease, but pass right through armor. Affected units gain magical attacks and a plus 50% boost to both base and armor-piercing weapon strength for 32 seconds. This is a really big bonus for any unit, and made generic units very dangerous to ethereal units back when they had 75% physical resistance instead of just 55%. But the spell has the same problem as the Enfeebling Foe when it comes to infantry and cavalry engagements. It simply doesn't last long enough. Combined with its 46-second cooldown and hefty winds of magic price when overcast, I'd recommend using it in monster and character duels and leaving multi-model units alone. Finally, we arrive at the Lore of Shadow's big, damage-dealing vortex spell, Pit of Shades. This is one of the most terrifying spells in the Lore of Shadows, as the wizard casts their foes into a mystical pit that nothing can escape from. Condemned to float through this void for eternity, this could be considered a fate far, far worse than death. The spell's pretty terrifying in game, too. Just like Occam's Mindrazor, Pit of Shades is restricted to the second half of a Shadow Wizard skill tree in the campaign map, and costs 200 gold in multiplayer. It's the most difficult spell in the lore to cast by far, beginning at 15 winds of magic and reaching 22 when overcast. That can take quite a while to build up, especially if you want to cast it more than once or twice in a battle. The spell has a 49-second cooldown, so even if you have plenty of winds of magic, you can't readily spam it. Finally, it has a 6-second cast time, so unless your target is trapped for some reason, it's not hard to dodge. Usually you want to cast it on blobs of infantry that are engaged in melee combat with your infantry, so they can't move away quite as readily. Besides those slight hiccups, however, Pit of Shades is great. With a range of 200 meters, your caster can safely cast it behind your lines, or on opponents half a battle line away. It only does 5 points of damage per second to any model caught in its grasp, but that's 100% armor piercing. When overcast, it does 8 points of damage per second, also 100% armor piercing. Over the course of 13 seconds, that can be up to 65 points of damage to any model caught in its wake, or 104 points of damage when overcast. Again, all of which is armor piercing. Even better, the vortex sucks those caught at the rim to its center, making the spell very difficult to escape. Cavalry and monsters are slowed, but can potentially get out. Infantry units, on the other hand, will be stuck in the pit for the full duration of the spell, with every model taking that 65 or 104 points of damage. The best thing about Pit of Shades, however, is its almost unique status as a stationary vortex spell. Most vortexes, once cast, will randomly wander before the spell ends, potentially leaving a nice blob of enemy units. It could also potentially blunder into your units and hurt you as much or possibly more than your opponent. Because the pit is stationary, however, you can cast Pit of Shades on an infantry blob that you've completely encircled with your units without any fear of friendly fire. This can be absolutely disgusting and compensates for its longer casting time, as you can tie enemy units down with your own while the wizard works their magic. When cast on a thickly packed blob of elite infantry that you've preoccupied in this manner, you can absolutely decimate a decent chunk of your opponent's army over the course of the spell's duration. Just like most vortexes, this is better in single player than multiplayer, as a skilled player won't bunch up their units like an AI will. That being said, it's such a good spell that I'm sure you can find uses for it in both scenarios. With the spells of the Lore of Shadows now thoroughly-ish covered, we can talk about the list of races that gain access to the Lore of Shadows in Total War Warhammer. I'll try to go through each faction relatively quickly, as well as how the lore accentuates their battlefield abilities, as there are quite a few. Some factions don't get full access to the lore, but they do have special characters that get partial access to shadow spells, so that'll get covered as well. The Beastmen have both Lord and Hero options that can access the Lore of Shadows through their Great Bray Shaman and Bray Shaman characters. Malagor, the Dark Omen, also has access to two spells from the Lore of Shadows, the Enfeebling Foe and the Penumbral Pendulum. In my experience, I found the Lore of the Wilds or Lore of Beasts to be slightly better for the Beastman playstyle. The big AoE direct damage spells from those lores were just a bit better with the scattered engagements favored by the true Children of Chaos, over the lines and vortexes of the Lore of Shadows. As befits their deceptive nature, the Dark Elves also utilize the Lore of Shadows. Supreme Sorceress Lords and Sorceress Heroes can use the entire lore, and Morathi can cast Malkuth's Mystifying Miasma and Pit of Shades. Due to the roster's focus on AP, the Dark Elves don't need this lore's high armor-piercing damage as much as their High Elven kin, but it's still never a bad choice, especially considering how regimented Dark Elf armies usually tend to be. The Empire can recruit Grey Wizard heroes, though for the time being they don't have a Lord-level equivalent just yet. They also have access to Ulrika Magdova, a legendary vampire wizard hero that has full access to the Lore of Shadows. In a spellcasting capacity, she doesn't really distinguish herself from a generic Shadowcaster, so she can be treated like a standard Grey Wizard when considering her spellcasting potential. The Lore of Shadows is actually an excellent magical tradition for the Empire to use, as many of its spells support its roster very well. The stalwart battle lines of the Empire State troops create static blobs that can be easily punished by the Penumbral Pendulum and Pit of Shades, and the Enfeebling Foe can actually even out those one-sided duels an Empire General oftentimes find themselves matched up against. The High Elves have plenty of ways to access the Lore of Shadows. Their Archmage Lords and Mage Heroes can potentially be full-blown Shadowcasters, while Lore Master of Hoeth Heroes can cast Malkuth's Mystifying Miasma. Teclis also has access to a single spell from the Lore of Shadows, though unfortunately it's the Enfeebling Foe. That's not a terrible spell to have, but it's not quite as flashy as the Lore's more damaging spells. Considering Teclis isn't a duelist lord, unless you break canon and put him on that darn Arcane Phoenix, this is best used to weaken an enemy lord before you goon them with several dragons or phoenixes. Again, not terrible, but it would be better on a martial/spellcaster hybrid character. Besides that, however, the Lore of Shadows works for the High Elves much like it does for the Empire. Their defensive front lines can pin enemies in place, so your Shadowcaster can obliterate them with the Lore's damaging spells. Just like the Empire, Kislev only has hero-level access to the Lore of Shadows. The Motherland can also recruit Ulrika Magdova, but the recent changes to Hag Witches has given them access to a generic Lore of Shadows caster as well. In a vein similar to the Empire and High Elves, Kislev's Stationary Alliance gives plenty of opportunities for the Penumbral Pendulum. In some cases, courtesy of their By Our Blood ability, Kislevite infantry is even better at it than these aforementioned factions. Additionally, almost all of Kislev's infantry units have non-armor-piercing ranged attacks. Considering they mostly face the heavily armored warriors of Chaos, this can be a problem. Fortunately, the Withering can reduce enemy armor down to a manageable level, letting the Motherland soldiers turn Chaos Warriors into a pincushion as they approach Kislev's battle lines. Being the foremost spellcasters in the Warhammer setting, the Slann of Lustria can also use the Lore of Shadows. Frankly, though, it's not the Lizardsmen's best lore of magic. They already have plenty of armor-piercing tools, and their durable infantry and plethora of monsters are better supported by the Lore of Life. While it can be fun to play around with, you don't need it by any means. Famir Baleffiend heroes are Norska's only way to access the Lore of Shadows. It's not a bad lore for Norska, but it also doesn't really play into their monster-focused playstyle. If you mostly bring Marauders, then Norska can use the Lore of Shadows like the Empire or High Elves. Hold the enemy in place with defensive infantry, then send them to the Shadow Realm. However, if you bring a lot of trolls or other monsters, you're less likely to get value out of the extreme armor piercing the Lore of Shadows brings. Even in that scenario, though, the Lore of Shadows can bring some good value. Few things are scarier than a bunch of trolls enhanced by Ogden's Mindrazor, even if that does only last 32 seconds. Of all the Chaos Gods, Slaanesh is the most heavily associated with the Lore of Shadows. This makes sense. A god of pride and vanity would logically be associated with the lore of magic heavily tied to illusions and deceit. Their roster reflects this, as they have more characters and units capable of utilizing the Lore of Shadows than any other faction. As far as lords go, Heralds of Slaanesh and Exalted Keepers of Slaanesh can access the Lore of Shadows if they so desire, and Demon Princes of Slaanesh can cast the Enfeebling Foe, the Withering, and Pit of Shades. If you'd rather bring a hero with the Lore of Shadows instead, Oloruses and Chaos Sorcerers of Slaanesh can also use shadow magic. Even the Marquis of Magicism, the Keeper of Secrets Regiment of Renown, can cast the Enfeebling Foe as a bound spell. That's a lot of shadow magic on the Slaanesh roster, which makes it rather humorous that the Lore of Shadows doesn't really support Slaanesh's playstyle. The Lore's damaging spells are best used on static battle lines, which is not Slaanesh's specialty unless you're playing with the warrior units. Most of the faction's best units also have excellent armor piercing as well, making the spells slightly redundant. Don't get me wrong, the Lore of Shadows is still a good lore for Slaanesh, but it's not as impactful as it could be on other factions. Lich Priests on the Tomb King's roster can use the Lore of Shadows, and it's definitely the best damage dealing lore they have access to. It compensates for the faction's lack of armor-piercing infantry, and its spells are much cheaper than the prohibitively expensive spells from the Lore of Death. That being said, you still probably want to bring a Lore of Nehekara caster instead, or at least alongside your Shadowcaster. The passive healing the Lore of Nehekara brings is too good to pass up on, and most of its spells are very cheap, making it very easy to keep your units in tip-top condition. Tzeentch has very little access to the Lore of Shadows, but he does have some. In multiplayer, Kyra's Fateweaver can cast the Penumbral Pendulum, but that's it. In single player, he can access the Fragment of Olgu through his skill tree, letting him cast Occam's Mindrazor and the Penumbral Pendulum instead of Clean Magic and Infernal Gateway, respectively. Despite the Pendulum's power, I personally consider this to be a bad trade, as Infernal Gateway is an amazing spell. Outside of Kairos, however, Tzeentch doesn't have access to the Lore of Shadows despite being the god of magic. This feels like a weird design choice, but as with many things of late, this was not CA's choice, but GW's. Just like Tzeentch, the Vampire Coast can only harness the Lore of Shadows through one of their legendary lords, in this case Count Noctilus. Count Noctilus can utilize Melkoth's Mystifying Miasma, the Withering, and Pit of Shades. Melkoth's slowing ability can give your gunline more time to shred an approaching enemy, and Pit of Shades is always good, but this Lore of Magic is probably not the primary reason you're bringing Count Noctilus to the battlefield. The Vampire Counts have more access to the Lore of Shadows than their amphibious relatives. Lamian Vampire Lords can use the Enfeebling Foe, Occam's Mindrazor, and the Penumbral Pendulum, while Vampire Heroes can use the entire Lore of Shadows if they wish. Despite this, you're almost always better served by taking the Lore of Vampires casters instead. Wind of Death is better than the Penumbral Pendulum, and the healing the Lore of Vampires brings cannot be overstated. Pretty much the entire faction hinges on that one Lore of Magic. The Lore of Shadows is nice, but it can't compete. The Warriors of Chaos can bring several characters capable of unleashing shadow magic upon their foes. Undivided Chaos Sorcerer Lords and Chaos Sorcerers can use the Lore of Shadows. Be'lakor, as befits his status as a Demon of Shadow, can use Shadowmancy. Finally, the Warriors of Chaos can bring Slaanesh Chaos Sorcerers and Demon Princes of Slaanesh, which function identically to the same units on the Slaanesh faction roster. The Lore of Shadows works pretty well with the Warriors of Chaos, though it's even better when used against them. Its high armor-piercing damage values makes it great at cleaving through their Hellforged steel, and if you're playing as the Warriors, you should pay close attention to where any enemy Shadow Wizards are located. Finally, at long last, we come to the Wood Elves. Both Elf and Forest Spirit-themed armies can use the Lore of Shadows with relative ease. Spellweaver Lords and Spellsinger Heroes can bring the full Lore of Magic to the Elven armies, while Branch Wraiths can bring Melkoth's Mystifying Miasma, the Withering, and the Penumbral Pendulum to Forest Spirit forces. Drycha can also use the entire Lore of Shadows if you want a Forest Spirit capable of using the entire lore. Ultimately, however, you probably don't need to bring a Shadowcaster with a Wood Elf army. The Azrai have the same relationship with the Lore of Shadows as Slaanesh does, as they avoid the blob fights that the Lore of Shadow rewards, and they also have a lot of armor piercing to boot. As always, it's not a bad Lore of Magic for the Wood Elves, but there are probably better choices out there for them. With that lengthy listicle of factions that can use the Lore of Shadows complete, we have come to the conclusion of this overview. Of all the Winds of Magic, the Lore of Shadows might be my favorite. Not because of how it functions in battle, though it is very good there, but I normally personally prefer to bring a Lifecaster instead. But the Lore of Shadows holds a sentimental value to me. When I played my first Call of Franz campaign, all the way back in 2017, the RNG wizard I got from the Battle of the Bloodpines was a Grey Wizard. Seeing my wizard absolutely destroy Orc boys with the Penumbral Pendulum was what sold me on Total War Warhammer in the first place, and began my long, deep dive into the world of Warhammer Fantasy. In some ways, I and any person who enjoys my content owes a small debt of gratitude to this Lore of Magic and the beautiful animations that accompany it. Speaking of people who watch my stuff, some of the footage in this video actually came courtesy of longtime watcher Zad, or Tazad, so I'm not sure to pronounce it. But his help was greatly appreciated, as is his boundless enthusiasm whenever I come back from a break in making videos. Any footage that he provided to me, I have attached a little note at the bottom of the video saying, Zad did this. That's all for today, though, so until next time, this has been Sigmar's Chosen, signing off for now.